Could you ask Ms Johnson to come back in, please? Right, Ms Johnson, ready to carry on?
Yes.
It's good, thank you. Yes, Mr Keith.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I'm going to move on to a separate topic, please, Ms Johnson, which is staff visits to hotels, something you referred to a couple of times this morning. In relation to staff visits, or BKC staff visits, were they housing officers or social workers, a combination of both, or was it just housing officers?
On the Thursday after the fire, it was just housing officers.
Okay, so let's deal with that. So on the 15th of June, the Thursday, and housing officers being sent to hotels. And you mentioned before that they were tasked to check on residents. Was that to assess their needs for short and long-term housing, or was it a welfare check?
It was more of a welfare check, really, to be honest, just to see how they were and to ask if they needed anything. If we were missing any information on the family composition, then we could have taken it at that time. But people were rehoused, offered emergency accommodation in a very difficult circumstances, so it was an opportunity just to see how people were.
Perhaps we could open your first statement, please, ORB case 000 35592 at paragraph 67, please. And we see there, I arrived at the town hall on the 16th. We had a morning briefing with senior officers from the housing team. Feedback from officers was that many families weren't in their rooms when officers attended on the 15th of June, so it wasn't a very successful endeavour. We'd put a letter under their door saying we'd come to see them and how to contact us if they were not in. Is that correct?
Yes.
According to Amanda Gill, your colleague, in her statement, prior to RBKC officers being deployed on the 15th of June to attend holidays, and the council was made aware that residents of Grenfell had called a meeting for that afternoon at Rugby Portobello Club and actually had requested RBKC to attend. So in relation to that, so that there was a view to send housing officers out to the hotels to do a welfare check, as you described it, but you also was made aware in the housing department that there was a meeting going on at the Rugby Portobello Club. Was consideration given to the likely unavailability of a number of residents before officers were sent to the hotels?
Yes, which is why we gave people, why we sent them with a letter to slide underneath the door. I'm not sure I related the two events together, to be honest with you, at the time of the meeting of residents at Rugby Portobello and people not being in their rooms.
In relation to the letter, a number of residents who have provided evidence refer to not receiving any such letter under their door. Are you confident that letters were placed under all of the doors of the residents who were placed in hotels?
I've said we put a letter under the door, and if my colleagues said they put a letter under the door, then I have no reason to think that they didn't.
We'll return to that in due course. But we've heard that this borough in North Kensington was rich in diversity. And was the letter that was provided in advance translated into various languages spoken by residents from that locality?
I don't believe so. I believe it was just in English.
So in relation to what we just read about the feedback that this was not a very successful endeavour to make contact with those affected residents placed in hotels, was there further attempts by RBKC to visit the residents after the 15th of June?
I was only responsible for the operation up until Sunday the 18th, so I don't know if there was any further attempts made after that weekend.
Okay. So we were talking about Thursday the 15th.
Yeah, so there wasn't on the Friday or on the Saturday.
Okay. And on the Sunday you say that...
I was stood down from being in charge of the operation.
So for that period, if somebody wasn't met or seen or contacted face-to-face on the 15th of June, it was unlikely that there was any contacts on the 16th or 17th.
Unless they contacted us, or unless we were aware that they wished to speak to us.
To turn to, you talked about placement of hotels, looking at ORBKC and surrounding boroughs. And one of those boroughs, of course, neighbouring borough, is the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And displaced residents from ORBKC were placed in hotels in that borough, isn't that correct?
Yes.
And Kim Smith, who was the chief executive and still is chief executive of the London Borough of Hammersmith Fulham, in her evidence, which I'm going to summarise, she's provided a statement of inquiry. She became aware on the 16th of June 2017 that displaced ORBKC residents had been placed in their borough, and we'll see in a moment in an email, concerns were raised with her regarding a particular Grenfell Tower displaced residents who needed support, and that references LBH 701, paragraph 63. In relation to ORBKC residents placed in the London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, can you recall whether actually Hammersmith and Fulham were informed residents had been placed in their borough, in hotels in that borough?
I did not tell London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham that we had placed people in their borough, but we were part of a tri-borough arrangement.
Yes.
So RBKC had a number of linked services with Hammersmith and Fulham and Westminster City Council. And so, although I hadn't taken responsibility for contacting Hammersmith and Fulham to let them know, Hammersmith and Fulham may have known because of the links with adult social care, which was a tri-borough service, I believe.
And in relation to housing, that was solely ORBKC. It was a sovereign service, isn't it?
Housing was a single borough service. Adult social care and children's services were both tri-borough services. And social workers at this point, by the 15th, were starting to be mobilised to make links with people who've been placed in accommodation.
Well, let's move to ORBK 000021897, please. And the bottom of the thread at page 2. Hopefully. Okay. So we see Jerry Crawley, the property and place manager at LB, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, an email to Kim Smith, who got married, and others on the 19th of June 2017. If we read, if we could go down, please, thank you. We've been in touch with Kensington and Chelsea this morning, and I can confirm they've placed tenants from Grenfell Tower in a total of 26 commercial hotels, which 3 are located in the following Hammersmith and Fulham hotels, and then they're listed. If we move down to, in the meantime, that paragraph, we visited all 3 hotels today and spoken with hotel management, tenants and support staff. And the date is the 19th of June, 5 days later. So we visited all 3 hotels today and spoke with hotel management, tenants and support staff. We have found inconsistent levels of service being provided to tenants at hotels. For example, the families at Ibis have an open tab with regards to food and bar. The Holiday Inn families have been provided with £500 and have access to breakfast. My main concern is for the tenants residing at Premier Inn in Hammersmith. There are 12 families who had not been contacted by Kensington and Chelsea since placement almost 6 days ago. We were the first to visit them at the hotel. They have no idea regarding what happens next and have not been provided contact details for Kensington and Chelsea. They receive 2 meals per day, breakfast and dinner, but have not received any cash subsistence. So in relation to that and those 12 families which were placed in Hammersmith and Fulham, forgive me, do you accept that 6 days later they haven't been contacted or visited by ORBKC?
Yes.
Accepting your involvement and responsibility in terms of controlling certain matters changed on the Sunday of that week, Sunday of the earlier week, which would be the 18th of June. This is the 19th of June. But can you explain how this occurred, how so many days had passed, and how those people were left with no support?
I don't know what day they were placed, so this email indicates they were placed on the 14th. If they were there, we would have attempted to visit them on the 16th or the 15th. If they weren't there, then we would have hopefully put a letter underneath the door, although I don't have an audit trail to say how many letters were put under. And then Friday and Saturday, my officers did not then do another phone around, nor did they not do a visit of people in those hotels. I can't comment on what happened from the Sunday after that.
So in relation to the leaflet, it says here, in stark terms, they've not been provided contact details for Kensington and Chelsea, which suggests no leaflet was placed underneath the door.
Yes, it does. It suggests quite strongly, and I have no reason not to believe it, that those families were placed and then they hadn't heard from us again, and they had not contacted us either.
Just the last part, and they had not contacted us either. What makes you say that?
Because they said they had had no contact with Kensington and Chelsea. So I would presume that if they had spoken to Kensington and Chelsea, that they had phoned us, then they would have relayed that message back to the people from Hammersmith and Fulham to let them know that they had actually spoken to K&C and were aware of the payments we were making and or how long they would be able to stay in that particular hotel.
And do you acknowledge that this shouldn't have happened and it was leaving these families in this position was unacceptable?
Yes, I acknowledge it must have been extremely difficult for those families to be left in that state of limbo, not knowing what was going to take place next.
Okay. Abandoned is a word the inquiry's heard to describe how those placed in hotels felt. Do you accept, both at hotels within the borough and outside the borough, that communication and contact with those people in hotels was deficient?
Yes, I acknowledge that we could have done more to contact those families in those hotels to make sure that they knew what was taking place. As I said, it was a very pressurised environment with people constantly approaching and us constantly booking, and perhaps we didn't give enough attention, not perhaps, we didn't give enough attention to the people who had been placed and giving them information and updates about what they could expect.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another subtopic, which is the provision of food. Once residents were placed in hotels, you set out in your statement at paragraph 84 that ORBKC had an arrangement with some hotels which gave either full board, half board, or just breakfast to the residents that were staying there. Is that correct?
Yes, it depended on the services that that hotel provided.
Yes. But there was an effort to provide food when there was a placement made.
If the hotel provided food, then we asked the hotel to provide food to the residents that had been placed there. But obviously lots of hotels are only provide limited services.
And in relation to dietary requirements of residents, bearing in mind, as I said, the rich diversity of the area of North Kensington we're dealing with and the time of year it was during Ramadan, was there any arrangements with those hotels for specific and religious dietary requirements?
I don't remember us making that specific request when we were booking the hotels on the 14th of June. We were very aware of the wide cultural diversity in Grenfell, and we knew that a lot of people, of course, were fasting at that time. To be honest, I don't remember what we said to those hotels at that point in time about dietary requirements, but we were aware that not all hotels would be able to provide a full board service, nor would they be able to provide food that necessarily people wanted to eat. You know, people have a wide kind of wide dietary requirements and likes and dislikes. And children, of course, eat at different times and want to eat earlier. So that's why we started to mobilise very quickly, trying to provide people with money in order so that they could both feed, go out and get food for themselves, but also, kind of buy basic services and needs.
RBKC, in their opening submissions to this module of the inquiry, have stated that, quote, the council admits that it should have done more in the immediate aftermath to make people from diverse backgrounds feel as comfortable as possible, in particular Muslim residents who were observing Ramadan at the time. The council acknowledges that many survivors who stayed in hotels were not provided with halal food. And do you accept that?
Yes, we would have been reliant on the hotels in order to be able to make that provision. And if they couldn't make that provision, then unfortunately those people wouldn't have been able to receive the food that they wanted.
You've provided and exhibited a spreadsheet in your statement, LG26. We don't need to look at it. It's RBK *01858. And that shows the arrangements with hotels which were in place as of the 18th of June. And it shows that of the 15 hotels named, only 4 provided breakfast, lunch and dinner, and 5 provided breakfast and dinner. So there was a reasonable proportion which were limited in what they could provide. And again, you accept that was the best you can do in terms of the hotels
Yes.
were available.
It was better to get a room in a hotel than not to get a room. And if they provided full board, that was great. But if they didn't, then it was just best to get a room.
So in relation to those which are not full board, you mentioned that there was a need and a recognition for financial support to allow those who were in those hotels to be able to purchase food for themselves.
Yes. I'm very aware, and I've worked in the field of social housing for a very long time. I've always done this job because I've wanted to help people to provide good quality accommodation on low incomes. And I'm very aware of how people live live on very low incomes, and it's very difficult to manage your budget. And I know that people will have left Grenfell and they won't have had any money in their own bank accounts and will have lived from paycheck to paycheck or from, kind of benefit to benefit. And people do eke out their meals on the basis of that they have bought enough to last the week. And there is no way that they can afford something different to that. And that's just in the normal course of events. So if you have something like this where you have a disaster and where people can no longer access their own food and and don't have any money and can't go to work, then it's important that we provided them with a financial resource so that they could provide food for themselves. Obviously, it's very difficult in hotels because they don't, as a rule, have cooking facilities.
Yes.
So, kind of the longer that goes on, the more difficult it becomes for people staying there in order to be able to eat the food that they want without having to rely on restaurants or takeaway services, which nobody wants to do in the longer term.
Yes. Well, I'm going to focus, if I may, just on the short term and the immediate aftermath. We've heard about the longer term difficulties and experiences of those who are bereaved survivors and residents in evidence earlier on in this module. So in relation to financial assistance, you mentioned in paragraph 84 of your statement, which I'll summarise again, but I'll read to you if you accept. We arranged money for those households to buy meals which were not provided. There was a policy established on what food people could have in hotels and what they could get money for. There was a generous food allowance per household. So in relation to this policy, which you refer to at paragraph 84 of your statement, do you recall when that policy was put in place?
No, it was very quickly put in place, but I can't remember whether it was on the 14th or 15th. It was a discussion that took place with Gold Group, or it may have taken place with finance colleagues about how we were to distribute cash and how we were to give people money so that they could make provision for themselves.
So we explored the different types of hotels, and some had less facilities in terms of food available, and you've recognised the need for financial support, and you've mentioned the arrangements, which we'll explore in a little bit more detail. But do you accept that in the first 7 days, that which we're exploring, is that numerous residents were still left without sufficient food or funds in those hotels?
If the hotel didn't have full board and the residents didn't know about the financial provisions being made, then yes, they would have found that difficult.
Another theme which emerges from the evidence we've heard from those who are in those hotels and experienced matters in the first 7 days is that many were unaware of what was available to them at the hotels. Do you consider that there was an issue regarding communicating what was available to them at the hotels?
Yes, I mean, I suppose I would have expected people in the hotels to ask the hotels what was available to them and being given that advice and information. Bearing in mind that we placed people into hotels on the 14th and 15th very quickly, we probably didn't have the information of a full suite of information available to us to give people that breakdown. But I completely accept the fact there was a failure of communication for us to follow that up with people placed in hotels.
Yes.
About exactly what was available and exactly what they could have.
Okay. Let's look at OBK 0009799, please. I'm going to invite us to turn to page 2, please. And it's an email at 1808 on the 17th of June. So we may need to scroll down a little bit. Okay. So 1808, so it's at the bottom of that page. Do we have that? If we could, is that page 2? That's it. So we see Fergus Coleman, 17th of June, 1808. And he is of HOS. Is that Housing Office Staff? What would HOS stand for?
Yes, something along those lines.
And I believe he's Head of Affordable and Private Sector Housing, WCC, so he's Westminster City Council.
So it's likely to stand for Housing Options Service.
Okay. In housing, Westminster, we got the date, we got the time, 17th of June, which is the Saturday. And it's an update provided by him. And I want to just draw out a few things from the latest update at 17:45. This update is derived from assessments which are being undertaken, and those must be assessments for accommodation. Is that correct? Temporary accommodation?
I don't know, because I wasn't copied into this email.
No. But I'm going to ask you to use your expertise for being 20 years in this field to help me in the environment that there was HOS staff undertaking assessments, and is it likely that these assessments were in relation to temporary accommodation?
Yes, I can only presume that, because this is the first time I've seen it.
Of course, and that's in fairness to you. Let's look at the document and you can familiarise yourself with it. The last bullet points. HOS officers have reported that the experience of doing the assessments has been very distressing. If we can turn over leaf, please, top bullet point. Feedback from officers returning from assessments is that many of the residents are very distressed. Some have had no food or water and have no funds. Others have been told that their hotel booking expires after today and they have not confirmation that they can stay after tomorrow. In bold, from the feedback I'm receiving, I would strongly recommend that there needs to be welfare support officers on site at the various hotels to offer guidance and reassurance and to deal with immediate welfare needs, not just housing needs. Due to the distressed nature of some of the residents, the quality of information being gathered to assess housing need is lacking. So you weren't copied in on that document there, but to give you the opportunity to familiarise yourself. And as we perhaps thought at the beginning, likely that housing assessments are being undertaken, and this is the feedback from those officers undertaking those housing assessments. Correct?
Yes.
Was this something that you were aware of on the 17th of June, these concerns being expressed in relation to Grenfell residents when housing assessments were being taken place?
No.
I want us to turn to another email, please. ORBK *000 2735, which we've touched upon earlier from recollection. This is an email we dealt with lower down in the thread, and if we look at the centre where it says Andrew Carter, Saturday, 17th of June, 7:59 p.m, so just before 8 p.m. And you are copied into this email, and we dealt with a thread earlier on, but this is the next matter which was mentioned in the thread. Many thanks. Mr. Hassani has also reported he hasn't eaten in 3 days. There's been suggestions from a few people that breakfast is available at the hotels with no other meals. Just a suggestion, but is it worth contacting the hotels to confirm if other meals are available and will be covered? And then Amanda Gill, further up in the thread, asks to contact a number to speak to the sender of that email, Andrew Carter. Again, were you aware of these matters? This is on the 18th of June.
The 17th of June, this is from Saturday, the 17th of June. So,
yes. Correct, Saturday, 17th of June, and the response from Amanda Gill is on the morning, Sunday morning, at 10:11.
On Saturday, I was either in Westminster meeting with Barbara Brownlee, who was my equivalent in Westminster, who had also been asked to mobilise housing officers to go out and undertake those welfare checks. I was copied into this email on Saturday evening, so it is very likely that I saw it, but I was still at Westminster till quite late, so I'm not sure whether I read it on Saturday evening. And on Sunday morning, I very likely saw it, but I don't remember, to be honest with you. And I would have taken from the fact that Amanda saw that email that she was going to call Andrew and to address that issue.
So just drawing this together, we've seen specific emails from colleagues from the Tri-borough, one from LBHF, one from Westminster City Council, independently arriving at concerns regarding food, welfare, communication with those who are placed in those hotels between 4 and 6 days after events on the 14th of June. Would you accept that this is a stark illustration that something had gone significantly wrong in the care that should have been provided to those in emergency accommodation?
I would say in certain instances there was definitely clearly a case that something had gone awfully wrong, that those people hadn't been provided with the food and or that they so desperately needed. And I'm, to be honest with you, horrified to read now that people were left in that situation, because I just didn't imagine for a moment that was actually taking place. I thought we'd been very clear with the hotels about what people could and couldn't have, which we were booked in, and expected that to be able to communicate it to the people that we had placed there. I completely accept there was a lack of communication by RBKC to the people placed in hotels, but it was very difficult circumstances, and undoubtedly I can only say we should have done better.
You mentioned that you were horrified. You mentioned certain instances where this occurred, and I'm going to suggest that this was a pattern, not an isolated case where it went horribly wrong. Isn't that correct?
I can't concur that from these emails that you have in front of me.
I've given you the opportunity to respond. I'm going to move on now to the provision of financial support. You've mentioned in your evidence that RBK staff were providing financial assistance from the outset, and perhaps we could read paragraph 86 of your witness statement, which is RBK 000 35592. And if we read paragraph 86, so this is what it says. On the 14th of June, housing officers started to give people money early in the day. Housing were the the main point of contact, so it made sense for housing officers to take care of this from the beginning. You mentioned how your team were given cash, and you were very aware that people would have no money on their person or limited access to funds. And you mentioned putting into place a policy that each household was to receive £500 for emergency funds in cash. And then from the 15th of June at Westway, there was a facility to hand out more cash. I do not know the full details of the policy from the 15th onwards. Can you help us in relation to that? Was that the case, that there was initial policy of £500 and then you're not really sure what happened from the 15th of June?
So there was an initial, in terms of what happened on the 14th, I believe the team went up with enough cash to give people who were presenting to us a small sum of money, £50, so that they had something. And then it was discussed, and I believe it's mentioned in the minutes of the meeting, that it was to make available £500 for emergency funds, cash being the easiest way to do that for people who may not have a bank account, may not have any of their cards, or have any documentation to be able to access any of those facilities that they may have. And so people presenting at the Westway or coming to the Westway were able to be given that sum of money. And people were able to and finance were arranging for that amount of money to be delivered to the Westway, and then people to be able to given that money. But to be honest with you, I don't really know what happened after that. It was just, how can we make sure that people have some money in order to be able to buy the essentials for the first couple of days, and then afterwards, it's not a housing department issue, it's a wider corporate issue of how we provide to help people in those early days.
If we could look at ORBK 000475576, please. This is an email sent on the 15th of June at 1826. We can see at the top. It's forwarded by Amanda Johnson to herself, so we can focus down on the email just below that from Daniel Smith. If you could scroll, thank you. And that's at 1826, forgive me, and you are in the body of recipients, Laura Johnson. So on the evening of the 15th of June, we've arranged for an out-of-hours service for any urgently required cash collections that cannot wait until tomorrow. The cashiers have already prepared batches of £500 ready for collection. And it talks about authorization forms, and in essence, it appears to be that the money would be available from the 16th of June at the Westway. Is that?
That would appear to be the case, yes.
Okay. In relation to, there's a reference in the email we just looked at which talks about a list of flat numbers. When we're right in the middle there, when we're just talking about batches of £500, it talks about a list of flat numbers. Flat numbers, one would assume, relating to Grenfell Tower, is that correct?
I believe so.
Can you help with this issue? Was financial assistance initially limited to those living in Grenfell Tower and not including walkway residents?
I don't remember, to be honest.
If we could turn to ORBK 000027735, please. A document we've seen already. This is the Grenfell Residents Action Plan from your meeting on the 15th of June 2017, an internal document which you refer to in your statement at paragraph 51. I wonder if we could scroll down, please, to page 2, and we'll see finance. And it says here, households to be given cash to cover living expenses, finance currently with corporate finance to arrange for cash to be made available, potential allocation of £1,000 per household. So drawing it together, there's fragments of information trying to assist you with when the policy was devised and implemented. It appears probably implementation more likely on the 16th of June. Is that fair?
It does appear to be the case, yeah.
And in terms of criteria, was there a criteria for allocating money?
I don't remember, to be honest with you. I'd have to see evidence of that to jog my memory.
Okay. In relation to the inclusion or exclusion of those who were walkway residents in those first few days, 14th and 15th, I'm just going to read a couple of examples and see if this assists your recollection as to whether that body of residents was excluded. Hisham Sherbika, in his statement, IWS quadruple 01305, paragraphs 76 to 78, says this. He's a walkway resident. We bumped into a council worker, a lady who had just finished work for the day, and I explained to her that we had ran out of money on the card and I could not feed my kids. She said if I needed money, she could give me some out of her own pocket, but I told her that I wanted what I was entitled to. I didn't want to take her own money from her. That was right. That wasn't right. The implication was that he wasn't able to get any financial assistance formally from the council at that stage. I want to give you another example, please. And this is an example not from a bereaved survivor resident, but an example from one of your colleagues, subordinates, in fact, Vinnie's Augustine. And she's provided a statement at inquiry. And at the time of the fire, Miss Augustine was a homeless team manager, which we referred to before when we were referring to one of the plans at the outset of this questioning. Perhaps we could open up her statement, please. RBK 000035411, please. Paragraphs 30, please. So this is on the 15th of June, we can see from surrounding evidence. And she says this, these are doing the checks. Whilst at the Holiday Inn, I visited an 87-year-old lady from the walkways who was distressed. She did not have her purse with her and therefore had no access to money and could not buy food. The Holiday Inn only provided breakfast for those staying there and therefore it would be necessary for them to purchase food. I went to a cash point and withdrew some money from my own personal account to give to her. I cannot remember how much I gave her. And one of the social workers then spent some time speaking with her. By the end of the visit, the lady seemed to be calmer and some of her concerns had been allayed. And I also contacted social services to inform them about this lady. Was this something that one of your housing team members raised with you, that there was an elderly walkway resident without financial support in a hotel on the 15th of June?
I don't remember that being raised with me directly. It may well have been, but I don't remember.
Would you acknowledge and agree that would be a matter of real concern?
Yes.
Can you assist with what the process, if any, in communicating that financial assistance was available to those affected on the 14th, 15th, 16th and 17th of June?
No, the financial assistance was being developed, and I cannot remember what the process was for letting people know that there was financial assistance available to them. As I said, it was a very fast-moving situation, and people were being assigned social workers and welfare workers. And I can only presume now, as a matter of hindsight, that information was relayed through that means, but there wasn't a written communication nor a social media communication sent out by the Housing Department to inform them of what financial assistance that there may be available to them.
So in terms of presumptions and assumptions, you mentioned it being a fluid situation, it would only be if somebody had spoken to a housing officer who visited them on the 15th of June, or word of mouth, quite frankly. That's the only way they would have found out. Is that
Yes,
right?
I was not in charge of sending out information about the financial assistance that we were giving. What I was advising of was the financial assistance we gave people on the 14th as an immediate cash sum, and then talking to the finance department about what people needed as an emergency amount of money to tide them over until more formal arrangements could be made. But no, I was not responsible for communicating, nor did I communicate or instruct anyone to communicate from RBKC exactly what the financial arrangements that were being developed were to the people who were staying in the hotels.
And it flows from what you have just said, that there's probably agreement with the next question, but RBKC in their opening submissions again to this module state that the council failed to provide the public with clear, consistent communications after the fire. As a result, individual residents missed out on receiving support to which they were entitled. In relation to that, do you accept that this was a fundamental failing in relation to the council?
Yes, I accept the council's opening statement and the way it has been phrased.
To deal with a discrete but important issue, which is residents which were discharged from hospitals. A number of residents were in hospital, and then in the passing days, some of those were discharged with nowhere to go. I want to turn to an email, RBK *0001026, please. It's in this email dated the 14th of June at the outset at 0741. We've touched upon this already, and I just wanted to revisit the third part of that email that you sent at 7:41 to your colleagues. We are setting up a protocol for those people in hospital who will be discharged and need to be rehoused, correct?
Yes, that's what I said.
And there's a recognition at that stage that there needs to be some system in place to ensure that those vulnerable individuals, by the very nature that they're in hospital, don't get missed. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Can you assist with what the protocol was for people being discharged from hospital?
No, I think that statement was drawn from, I was obviously sitting in the Beck at that point, and had probably had a conversation with my colleagues in adult social care about where the responsibility lay for what we did. I'm not aware that the housing department ever actually set up a protocol for what happened for people who were being discharged from hospital. From recollection, I believe adult social care took that on board as something that they would then liaise with the hospitals about. And about all hospitals have social workers, and it would be for them to liaise with the social workers in the hospitals about what we did when people were discharged. But we ourselves, nor my team, I don't believe, drafted a protocol for people being discharged from hospital.
Well, let's look at paragraph 37 of your statement, please. That's RBK 000035592. Just to draw out what you've said. You say the protocol for people being discharged from hospital. So paragraph, just to ensure that we're all on the same, 37, please. Could we just go over these? Thank you. Bottom of page 9. Thank you very much. The protocol for people being discharged from hospital was organised through adult social care and family and children's services, which you just said a few moments ago. They had social workers at hospital to liaise with the hospital families and what housing and or support they needed when they're due to be discharged. ASC, adult social care, would then make this information available to housing. We would then arrange for them to be placed in hotels. So in short, the protocol was that ASC would do that first contact, and they would inform you that there was somebody who was being discharged, and then that you would arrange a placement in hotels.
That was my belief, that was the situation that was going to take place.
Did that work? Is that what happened?
I can't remember, to be honest with you.
Okay, let's try and help your memory. I'm going to give you a suggestion so that you can have that in mind when we're working through the documentation. I'm going to suggest that there was some confusion and a lack of communication between your department and ASC regarding the procedures for providing housing for those discharged? So I don't expect an answer now. I'm going to try and assist your recollection by looking at some documentation. Let's look at RBK quadruple 6745. This is an email on the 16th of June at 1957. Amanda Johnson, you were not copied in. Dear Beck, it would be good if we know about any people being potentially discharged from hospital in the short term, especially as we enter the weekend. So your senior colleague being proactive, ascertaining if anyone is going to be discharged, correct?
Yes.
And if we could turn to RBK 000115888, please. Bottom of page 1. That's probably okay where we are. Thank you very much. This is an email the inquiry's seen, I think, already. Michelle Scaife, 17th of June, 1423. So this is the Saturday, the weekend. My understanding from a brief discussion with Amanda Johnson Housing this morning is that anyone who will require accommodation at the time of discharge needs to be flagged with them as soon as possible. Any information pertaining to family members that will need housing with person for discharge will also be a benefit to housing. Apparently, hospital teams are directing, I should probably just read, this information to housing or via ASC community liaisons. I think it would be helpful for us all to have one directive on this, because at the moment there's a number of lists flying around and assumptions about who is doing what. Are hospitals sending information direct to housing, or is all information coming to us here at Adult Social Care and we pass it on to housing? Rob, Paul, that's Paul Hargreaves, as we can see in the list of recipients. Are you able to clarify what the message is that housing has given hospitals in terms of this, or how hospital teams are currently working in terms of this matter? Two different departments within OBKC, not seeking to attribute blame to any particular department here, but was it the case that information was falling perhaps between the two stools, between housing and between ASC, and some residents were discharged from hospital without OBKC knowing?
That may well have been the case. It was my understanding that Adult Social Care were dealing with it. I probably had a discussion with Amanda, and we had followed this up, but it sounds from this email that there wasn't clarity on who was dealing with the discharge of people leaving hospital, and what we were seeking to do was to have clarity on that.
Yes.
We're probably concerned that people might be discharged over the weekend period, and that would be more difficult for us to deal with because there wouldn't be such a number of staff available.
As a general observation, Sue Redmond, who gave evidence yesterday, she was at London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and she held a pivotal role as the HALO, the Humanitarian Assistance Lead Officer, in those early days. And she referred in her evidence to inquiry yesterday that there was confusion at times in these sort of situations, and this was a product of different parts of the council operating as silos. In relation to that phrase, operating in silos, was there an issue with different departments during this response, operating in silos?
I think all departments within the council were trying to do their very best in a very difficult circumstances, and information was shared at the gold meetings that were happening twice a day about what people were managing with and what help that they needed. So yes, people were operating on their own initiative, doing their own thing, but there was an opportunity twice a day to come together and talk about those problems, and we were all available to each other in that I knew Sue Redmond. I was sitting next to the Tri-Borough Director of Family and Children's Services during this time, and so there was an opportunity outside of the meetings to talk to me about any areas that there was fears where there was may not have been enough communication on. I was sitting in an open plan office on the same floor as adult social care and children's services. So although people were all doing their own thing, there was plenty of opportunity to come and talk to me, or me to talk to my colleagues about issues that needed to be resolved.
We can move on to another topic. And we know that on the 16th of June, the London Local Authority Gold Resolution was activated. And during the evening of the 16th of June, you've mentioned at paragraph 77 of your statement that Nicholas Holgate asked you, together with your colleagues Amanda Gill and Rachel Dalton, to go to the Westminster Beck to meet with Barbara Brownlee. And Barbara Brownlee was the Director of Housing at Westminster. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what did you understand to be the purpose of that meeting?
I understood we had had a meeting earlier in the day which had been truncated because there had been an invasion of the town hall. We were evacuated from the town hall, and as I say in my statement, it was a terrifying experience. At that meeting, we were asked to go and meet Barbara Brownlee, of the view that Westminster were to make the housing team available and offer assistance to RBKC, which I was more than happy to accept. The more people, the better.
If we scroll down to paragraph 80, please. Thank you. We're on the 18th of June, and it says at this stage, third line, I was informed at some point late morning or early afternoon by Nicholas Holgate I was no longer leading the housing effort and that Barbara Brownlee would be leading my team. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that would be the Sunday, as you mentioned, you no longer were leading housing efforts.
Yes, I believe the decision had been taken before that, but I wasn't informed until Sunday.
Just going back to that meeting on the 16th of June, that evening when you went to the Beck at Westminster to meet Barbara Brownlee for the first time. According to Amanda Gill, your colleague, at that meeting with Barbara Brownlee, RBKC were criticised for the response. Is that correct? Do you recall that?
I'm sure if Amanda recalls that. I don't recall it particularly, but yes, there was probably a general view that we were not doing as well as we could.
And specifically, paragraph 51, it was relayed back to you and the other attendees that it was not appropriate to leave residents in hotels over the weekend, and that WCC, Westminster City Council, would be completing suitability assessments on Saturday morning. Does that assist your recollection?
Yes, I mean, we went to Westminster on Saturday morning to meet Barbara and a group of officers at a housing office somewhere in Westminster, Liscombe Grove, somewhere massively inconvenient, I have to say. And officers were going to be deployed to do assessments of people in their hotels. The more people who could help, the better, to be honest with you. The assessments, as I understood it at that point, were really as a push from central government in order to be able to rehouse everybody within 3 weeks. So that was the driver behind it, not necessarily welfare checks, but because central government had been convinced that it was possible to rehouse all of the people who were coming out of Grenfell Tower survivors into accommodation within a 3-week period.
And you refer to, and perhaps for context and to assist everybody, there was an announcement, is it right, on the late afternoon of the 16th of June by the Prime Minister in relation to placements, housing placements. Is that correct?
I believe there was, yes.
And you mentioned that there was a guarantee that people would be rehoused in 3 weeks. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And in relation to that matter, I've asked you a number of questions today about emergency accommodation, and this is a different type of accommodation and it's outside the scope of this module. But in relation to this point, did that announcement have an impact on the ability of your department to operate?
Yes.
And can you assist us what that impact was?
Because the government had made a decision that initially it was going to be 2 weeks and then they extended it to 3 weeks, that all people were going to be made rehousing in 3 weeks. There became all the efforts, large parts of the efforts of my team were then to be directed towards assessing the needs of the people in hotels and the offers that we had received from other housing associations and other councils in order to place those families in that accommodation. And it was, if I may say, an enormous waste of everybody's time. And I categorically stated, both on the Friday to the Housing Minister when he came to see me and anybody who would listen to me, that there was no way that we were going to rehouse everybody who needed rehousing within 3 weeks, because it was not the right approach to take to people who were traumatised and had come out of the most awful situation. What they needed was a considered and thoughtful response about what we could offer them and where they would like to live. People were in absolutely no fit state to make decisions about where they wanted to live and what they wanted. What they needed was a compassionate and considered response. What they didn't need was a target from central government that wasn't achievable.
Okay. I'm going to move on, if I may, to another document, RBK 000 49580, please. And this is an email between your housing team members, Rob Shaw and Claire Wise, on the 17th of June at 7:03. This would be the morning after the meeting with Barbara Brownlee. Could I just help you with some of the context, if that's okay, and read out that email, please? So it says this: Amanda, Laura and Rachel attended a government goal meeting last night. We've been told Westminster are taking over from us because we've been deemed ineffectual. Yep. Extremely valid criticism of the RBKC Central Command, however, raised at this meeting too. Don't say anything yet. Amanda, Laura and Rachel have to head to Westminster this lunchtime, so waiting for the official line. And Claire Wise responds, maybe an issue regarding the timings or later on in the thread. Actually, it's further up, doesn't she? Forgive me. The top of that thread. It's valid in some respects, but it is shameful that we haven't been supported by London or national services. How are local authorities expected to have their expertise? There needs to be a centralised control team to be deployed to major incidents to guide the local authorities to it. Fire brigades have it. Every single person tried their absolute best. Housing and planning staff should not be coordinating this. It needs major expertise. Frustrating and upsetting. I just want to explore a couple of matters which are opinions expressed by your colleagues. Do you agree with the opinion that the criticisms made in relation to RBK Central Command at the meeting you were at were valid?
Yes, in some respects. That it was an incredibly difficult situation. It was a national disaster, which perhaps when you're in the middle of it, you don't really appreciate how big it is, because you are in it trying to deal with it and manage the results from it. But of course, other people are standing on the outside of it and making very different judgments. So whereas I can quite understand why people found us to be ineffectual, all we thought we had tried our very hardest, and we had booked hundreds of hotel rooms and placed people in lots of accommodation, and we were definitely thinking about what the next step was. So it felt quite harsh, but I can understand how people drew that conclusion. But it was, if I may say, it was a national disaster. It wasn't an RBKC disaster. It was a national disaster. And when you're in the middle of that, it was utterly shocking to see how people stepped back from RBKC. London Gold was enacted, which was great, but it is a very difficult situation when the national government are briefing against you and you just don't know where to turn.
want to deal with, you described it as a national disaster, and I want to deal with the final topic, which is your assessment of the adequacy of the response by RBKC. And perhaps you could turn to paragraph 89 of your witness statement, please. You could scroll down, please. Thank you. Bottom of page 24. Thank you very much. Under the heading Adequacy of Response, the emergency planning response by RBKC should have been better. It did not adequately meet the needs of either the families whose lives were devastated by the fire or the local community who were also horribly affected by the events of the 14th of June. In relation to that, do you stand by those comments?
Yes, I do.
However, I think it should be acknowledged that this was an unprecedented event, and I believe any borough faced with managing a response to a fire of this magnitude and loss of life of this scale would have struggled to provide the level of help and assistance required. Again, is that your view?
Yes, it is.
We could go to paragraph 93, please. Put your assessment in complete context. The people so terribly affected by the events of the 14th of June were let down by central government. They did not appear to have any emergency planning function to put into place in the event of a disaster such as this. Again, is there anything you want to say in relation to that comment about the involvement of central government?
No, I think I've set it out very clearly. They didn't appear to have any emergency planning that they could contribute towards the council with. I understood afterwards about London Gold, but at the time, central government's response seemed to be one of asking for figures about how many placements we had made, not offering a help or assistance.
I want to revisit a final matter which you mentioned, and I asked you about earlier on in the narrative, which is at page 6 of your statement. That's paragraph 24. And it's a view you say that you arrived at after events and not at the time. RBKC was not sufficiently prepared to deal with a fire that was so devastating and of such a significant impact. Why did you form that opinion?
I would say that was fairly self-evident, that I don't think that, as I've said at the end of my statement, I don't think any local authority was really equipped to prepare with something which was a national disaster and needed to be dealt with on a regional or national basis. It was caught in the eye of a terrible, terrible storm, and it took some time to appraise and assess what had happened. And that's very hard to do once you're dealing with events and just trying to cope with an unprecedented level of both media interest and a highly traumatised community which had just witnessed something that nobody should ever have to see. So, no, I don't think RBKC was sufficiently prepared to deal with a fire of this scale and this disaster. I don't think any local authority would have been able to deal with it. That's not to say that it couldn't have been dealt with better at the time by a local authority like RBKC, but we just weren't in a position to manage the scale of the disaster as it unfolded.
Ms Johnson, they're all the questions I have at this stage for you. Mr Chairman, there has been a number of suggested questions which have flowed through.
It would probably be sensible, wouldn't it, to take the afternoon break at this point anyway?
Yes.
So, Ms Johnson, as you know, we have to have a break at this point so that Council can check that nothing's been overlooked and so that others can suggest questions that perhaps we ought to put to you. So we'll break now until 3:20 and then we'll come back and see if there are any more questions that we need to ask you.
Okay.
All right?
Thank you.
And I think as before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're away. All right. Thank you very much. I think that ought to give you long enough.
Yes,
if you need more time, just let us know.
I will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you ask Ms Johnson to come back in, please? Right, Ms Johnson, well, we'll see if there are any more questions. Yes, please.
Just one follow-up question, Ms Johnson, if I may. In relation to, when you were talking about the 3-week announcement in relation to, was it your phrase, permanent housing?
Yes, or to be placed a follow-on housing.
Follow-on housing.
Yeah.
I want to be precise as the determination.
Yeah.
So in relation to follow-on housing, and you mentioned in evidence that you thought that was wholly inappropriate in terms of a period of time. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we have displaced residents placed in emergency accommodation, i.e. hotels, in those early days. We've got this 3-week announcement in relation to placing those affected in follow-on housing, which you thought was wholly unrealistic. What did you consider did you consider what the correct interim approach would be?
So, as I explained earlier in my evidence, I'm really aware of how few social housing units there are in RBKC which are available in any 1 year. I'm even more aware that there's 50,000 people in temporary accommodation in London, maybe more now. That was 5 years ago. And there is a huge problem with homelessness and a lack of social housing. So I was very aware that there was going to be a very limited number of available housing units to be able to offer people who were coming, who needed to be rehousing after Grenfell. And I was very aware as well that people didn't just need to be popped in the first flat that became available. That wasn't the right approach. There was a lot of offers coming in from housing associations and other local authorities. But whether that would be something that the people who needed rehousing wanted was an entirely different matter. And quite rightly, they should be given time and space in order to be able to make decisions. And I just didn't and couldn't see how people who had been through such an awful traumatic experience could possibly be asked to make a decision about where they wanted to live or what type of housing they wanted to live in a period straight after the fire. And I knew that the type of accommodation that we'd been offered, other social housing units across London, probably wouldn't be what people wanted. So I didn't have an alternative to where to go from hotels and what happened before people were permanently housed. But I did rather suspect that people wouldn't want to be just bunged in a tower block in Wandsworth and told you'll be all right there for a couple of years until we find you something permanent. What people really probably wanted was something entirely different, which is quite a personalised service where people considered what their wants and needs were, and quite rightly, kind of some thought and consideration about where they wanted to go next. And that may well mean that people stayed in hotels for a longer period than anybody ever envisaged at the outset. But moving people and then moving people again and then moving people again is just awful. It's awful when you haven't been through a disaster, but even more awful when you have. But I also knew it's a very difficult problem to solve because there just aren't enough social housing units in London and the South East. So supply was always going to be difficult in the wake of overwhelming demand, not just from the wider housing waiting lists of all boroughs, but also from people who needed to be rehoused, who needed a thoughtful and considered approach. And I said on the Friday that I thought it would probably take around 2 years to rehouse everybody, and I think it probably took about that length of time.
Finally, Ms Johnson, in relation to events between the 14th of June and those days when you were involved up until the 17th of June, is there anything now that you would have done differently?
Gosh, yes. If I would have made it a priority to communicate with all of the people who had been placed in hotels. I didn't realise at the time that people had such a lack of information. I suppose I was dealing with events as they arose, as was my team, in terms of placing people cordons. Huge amount of my time was spent answering press inquiries, asking for information. But actually, now being able to step back from it and looking at it with hindsight, actually what people really needed when they came out of there was they needed people to come around and see them straight away and be able to talk to them and just run them through what was happening and really explain, kind of how we were managing that situation. We just didn't have the manpower, and we probably didn't think it through in careful enough detail about what people really needed after they'd come out of that. So that's what I would, that's my reflection on that, is that people really needed a great deal more communication and understanding and information from the local authority than was available. And that's what I would definitely do different.
Ms Johnson, all that remains for me on behalf of the council team is to thank you again for attending today. And we've got no further questions.
And Ms Johnson is right, of course, that I should thank you for coming a second time to give evidence to the inquiry, albeit on a completely different area of our investigations. We are, of course, very grateful to you for making the time to come and give your evidence. It's been helpful and very interesting to hear what you have to tell us. And so, as I say, we are very grateful to you. Thank you very much, and you're now free to go, of course.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Keating. Now, we have another witness coming, but not till tomorrow, is that right?
That's correct. Mr. Millett will be calling Mr. Holgate, the former town clerk.
Yes,
tomorrow.
very good. Well, thank you very much. So at that point, we'll close for today, and we will resume the hearing tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.